Orcs are a staple of medieval fantasy. You really do get to see them everywhere, and when it comes to a D&D adventure, you never can go wrong with orcs. They are the perfect stereotypical villain, very commonly used as troops for the Dark Lord, and are always a great motivator for the common races to band together against a common foe. When it comes to Dungeons & Dragons, literally every single race hates them. Elves and dwarves both attest to have a strong ancestral hatred towards them, and humans are the ones that have suffered the most to their hordes, literally losing gods to them. Look, nobody is on the side of the orcs, not even they themselves are when you count in all of their massive civil wars. This video is brought to you by Epic Encounters, who just released their new set featuring frost creatures. Epic Encounters sells these boxes with everything that you would need to run themed encounters using miniatures and battle maps. This box is called the Hall of the Orc King, and it comes with 20 orc miniatures. Look at these babies. They are highly detailed and each with their cool poses. Check out this one. This is the Orc King. He looks badass. Here you can see some of the orc grunts as well. The battle map looks fantastic as well. Now the cool thing about the box is that it comes with a booklet that basically details you a mini adventure that you can run using these miniatures and of course the battle map. So it's not just the assets that come with the box, it all comes with an epic encounter for each of the two sides of the battle map. The booklet also of course has the stats for every single one of these orcs. Here you can check out the stats for the Orc King. It's so cool. Now this is the Hall of the Orc King. They just released it about 2 days ago, but they have more. They have a box with frost giant encounters and miniatures. They have one with kobolds and one with a dragon. They're also working on a goblin and hydra boxes in the future, so check out these guys. The link is in the description and get yourself one of these boxes. If you ever wanted to get into the whole miniature side of D&D, then this is a great place to start. You literally get everything that you need: the miniatures, their stats, a battle map to try them out, and of course a booklet with the encounters to use them. It is perfect. Once again, the link is in the comments and in the video description. Check them out. Now let's go and check out the monster manual and see what they tell us about the orcs. From the get-go, we can see that they are indeed a big deal. How so? Well, we actually get 4 dedicated pages for them, which is extremely rare. However, only 2 of those pages actually provide lore. Starting up, it says that orcs are savage raiders and pillagers. They have stooped postures, low foreheads, and piggish faces with prominent lower canines that resemble tusks. Please note the piggish face part, that is of course important. In here we're told of a popular orc myth, and it talks about the greater god of the orcs, Grumsh One-Eye. It talks about how it was actually the other intelligent races that betrayed the orcs in the beginning by claiming all of the lands in the world without allowing the orcs a land to settle. And because of that, now they are charged with taking from others what was denied to them. Down here he goes even further by exclaiming that Corlan Larethian, the chieftain god of the elves, actually took one of Grumsh's eyes in a battle, and since then, orcs have had a special hatred of the elves, who they go out of their way to slaughter whenever possible. Down here he talks further about how orcs are like literal plagues, who go about satisfying their bloodlust by plundering villages, devouring or driving off roaming herds, and slaying any humanoids that stand against them. They then take all of the gold and wealth from the villages that they destroy, and then retreat whence they came. Next, here they talk about the orcs' preference for a nomadic lifestyle. Since the orcs have a strong necessity for bloodlust, they make sure to always be on the move and to always have good targets to strike at. Because of this, they never settle permanently, and instead, they take over castles or caves and then settle there momentarily. They make no innovations and instead merely improve on the defenses. When an existing territory is depleted of food, an orc tribe will then divide into different roving bands who will then scout around for future places to settle. When each party returns, it brings back trophies and news of targets ripe for attack, the richest of which is chosen. The tribe will then set out en masse to carve out a bloody path into its new territory. Now this part is interesting here. Occasionally a powerful war chief unites scattered orc tribes into a single rampaging horde Horde, which runs roughshod over the other Orc tribes and humanoid settlements from a position of overwhelming strength. Orc hordes are a big deal. Now, unlike other races, Orcs reject notions of racial purity. They proudly welcome ogres, trolls, half-orcs, and orogs into their ranks. They respect power over all. Then, as the last piece of general Orc news, we have their incredible ability to breed. Luthic, Orc goddess of fertility, demands that Orcs procreate often and indiscriminately so that Orc hordes swell generation after generation. The Orcs' drive to reproduce runs stronger than any other humanoid race, and they readily crossbreed with other races. When an Orc procreates with a non-Orc humanoid of similar size and stature, the resulting child is either an Orc or a half-Orc. We will talk more about this later, of course. Now, Orc warships only last for as long as they bring fear and strength towards the tribe. The second that they show weakness, they typically just get killed. Very important, down here it says that Grumsh bestows special blessings upon warships, making them unnaturally stronger. Now over here they cover the Orc eyes of Grumsh, which are the clerics of Orc society. It says that when an Orc slays an elf in Grumsh's name and offers the corpse as a sacrifice to the god of slaughter, an aspect of the god might actually appear. The aspect will demand an additional sacrifice, one of the Orc's eyes, symbolizing the loss that Grumsh suffered at the hands of his greatest enemy, Corlan Larethian. If the Orc plucks his eye out, the Orc is blessed with clerical powers and spell-casting abilities. They then become revered in the tribe and they advise the warships. Orcs in here are described as special Orcs that are sometimes randomly born. Orcs consider them a blessing of Luthic. These Orcs are stronger and more intelligent, performing actual feats of strategy and tactics on the battlefield. When there are many Orogs, they rally and hang out with one another, making their own individual bands. Orc chieftains tend to fear them, for they are way smarter than normal Orcs, and they fear that they will supplant them with their extra strength and intelligence. And then here, of course, we have the stat sheets. I don't want to go too deep in here because we actually have a lot to cover, but you can see here that the basic standard Orc is, as it is, extremely powerful. What you might not know is that this stat block right here, for the most part, is supposed to represent your standard, just boring random Orc. It's not even just a warrior Orc, it's just a normal citizen Orc. Your standard Orc person is miles ahead in strength and capabilities than your standard, normal, run-of-the-mill human, and this is supposed to represent that. Not much to see here otherwise though, just note that the Orcs are not very intelligent, and also note that the Orog is actually fairly intelligent. But that's just about it. Orcs are also supposed to be below average in wisdom and charisma, but it seems that they were made to be average in 5th edition, which is interesting. Now with that said, let's go ahead and talk about what the Monster Manual did not tell you about the Orcs. The single most important thing to cover before we cover anything else is to be very clear about the fact that there are actually 4 completely different kinds of Orcs. The Monster Manual and even Volos Guide to Monsters failed to really simmer this part in. It makes sense why the Monster Manual wouldn't, since the Monster Manual is not necessarily a Forgotten Realms canon book, but it is interesting that Volos Guide to Monsters really didn't. Now this is the picture that we're given for the Orcs in the Monster Manual. You can see how the Orc barely has any forehead, you can see that it has a relatively normal nose, but further you can tell how it is actually dressed quite nicely. You see here some nice boots, you can see the shin guards, a cute little belt, the furs are actually quite nice. You can even see here that the Orc has taken the time to tie up a big piece of jawbone on his shoulder. You can tell that there's actually a lot of effort that this Orc has put into his own vestments, which is interesting, yet the actual colors of the dress here are very subdued. The colors don't really pop out, they don't shine out at you. Now this is what you would call a gray Orc. If not for all of the different factors that I just gave you, then for the simple factor that its skin is gray in color. Gray Orcs are merely only one of the types of Orcs that you will find in the world, though funnily enough they are the only type of Orc that you will actually probably never get to see, because they don't actually live in the parts of the world where you will most likely play in 5th edition. This is the map of the Forgotten Realms in 5th edition. Gray Orcs are not seen anywhere on this map. Instead, if we expand the map a bit to showcase the entirety of Faerun, the actual continent, you will see that Grey Orcs actually chill around here. All of this area is where you might see them because they are nomadic. So again, if you're playing Baldur's Gate or if you're playing the 5th edition adventures, these are not the orcs that you will be seeing or fighting. However, when you read the Monster Manual and Volos Guide to Monsters, these are... However, when you read the Monster Manual and Volos Guide to Monsters, these are generally the orcs that are being described to you. Now, obviously, most of the factors that make orcs orcs and makes orc civilization are generally the same throughout all kinds of orcs, so the stuff that you might read in Volos Guide to Monsters and the Monster Manual would apply, generally speaking, to a lot of orcs, including the gods, which of course are all the same, but whenever you hear talk about the orcs being nomadic, typically that only applies to Grey Orcs and not any other kind. See, Grey Orcs are different to other kinds of orcs, and a little special because of one interesting reason, a reason that you probably didn't know, because the Monster Manual and Volos didn't really tell you. That is because these orcs, they come from a different world. This part is actually literally just like World of Warcraft. Grey Orcs come from a portal, a portal that connects to the Grey Orc homeworld, a planet that was completely dominated by their kind. To keep it short, a mage from the High Imascari Kingdom, all the way over here, opened up a portal to this other world in one of his experiments, but the man was subsequently killed later on in an unrelated event. The portal was just left open for many years, just sitting there until the orcs in their homeworld discovered it on their side and used it to mount a massive invasion of Faerun. The invasion was the single biggest orc-related event in the history of the planet, and a few gods of the Untheric pantheon ended up just dying trying to quell the horde. Eventually, though, they did manage to destroy the horde, and the remaining stray Grey Orcs, they just scattered all across the land. That event was particularly interesting because, as you know, gods become more powerful the more followers they have. Grumsh was very powerful, as you might imagine, in a world filled with orcs, and when the portal was open connecting both the orc homeworld and Faerun, Grumsh could move his grand infinite power over to Faerun. It was interesting because all of these orc clerics that came out from that portal were all casting like super mega high level spells from the get-go, which made the invasion particularly brutal. Those clerics even had the ability to summon avatars of Grumsh with their high level spells. It was crazy. It's like, imagine orcs but with 9th level spells. This image right here that we were given for the orcs in the Monster Manual is actually supposed to represent the Grey Orcs. These orcs are more civilized than normal orcs, and they are highly religious. They also take a lot more care for their utensils, weapons and armor, and of course clothing, as you can see, and they are nomadic. Now that they have no place to be after the Great War, they simply roam around in a nomadic lifestyle. It is also very, very important to note that they are not as wildly savage as normal orcs. They don't get that drive to bloodlust like normal orcs do. Normal orcs need to go out and obliterate things. These Grey Orcs don't quite get that as bad. So now when I say normal orcs, what do I exactly mean? Well, I mean mountain orcs. Mountain orcs are very different because, well, they have very much pig noses. This is probably the single most just what the fuck moment that you might get about this video, because the Monster Manual kind of mentioned it a little bit but didn't really go in depth about it at all. Orcs do have faces that look kinda like pigs. Let's look at some of the descriptions so that you can see how far this rabbit hole goes. This is 1st edition. I don't even have to give you a description because you can actually plainly see it here on the picture, but alas, it says here, orcs appear particularly disgusting because their coloration, brown or brownish green with a bluish sheen, highlights their pinkish snouts and ears. Their bristly hair is dark brown or black, sometimes with tan patches. In 2nd edition, it was taken back a bit. They decided that they wanted to make their faces look piggish without necessarily making them look like literal pig faces, like how they had done it previously in 1st edition. You can see that here where it says, in general, general, they resemble primitive humans with gray-green skin covered with coarse hair. Orcs have a slightly stooped posture, a low jutting forehead, and a snout instead of a nose. Though comparisons between this facial feature and those of pigs are exaggerated and perhaps unfair. Now in here they don't say it is a pig snout, they just say snout. However, here we have 3rd edition. It says up here, this creature looks like a primitive human with gray skin and coarse hair. It has a stooped posture, low forehead, and a pig-like face with prominent lower canines that resemble a boar's tusk. So they don't say necessarily that they have a snout as much as they just say that they have pig-like faces. It's really difficult to tell exactly what they really want because they just keep switching it up. Now, the source book that matters the most, however, at least for us, is a book called Races of Faerun, a Forgotten Realms source book. It matters to us the most because this is a book specifically about the world that we're talking about. In here it says, quote, "Their eyes are always a deep shade of red, and their faces are dominated by porcine snouts and large tusks," end quote. Now this is made more interesting because right under this we have art for orcs. Now it doesn't specify if the one in this picture is a grey orc or a mountain orc, it just says orc horde under it, but you can clearly see the pig noses. Now they are not what I would describe as porcine snouts, but they are definitely pig noses. Now here's another picture. This one though is of an Orog. Now Orogs are a breed of the mountain orcs. It is very difficult to see because the picture is low quality, but you can kind of make out a very strong pig nose in there as well. So yeah, it is actually difficult to tell the extent of the pigness of their faces, and thing is, it is likely that you might even find some that are extremely pig-like, while others that may be less so. That is because of the fact that orcs literally reproduce with anything that moves, and what comes out of those unions is typically very orcish in style, regardless of the other species that they reproduced with. That means that in general, orc tribes might have a lot of features of other races mixed in with theirs, which makes each individual orc look different from others. The seed of an orc is very strong. When an orc reproduces with a non-orc, you can get either a half-orc or just a straight-up full orc. That is to say, it's not just that their seed is strong, but also the orc genes that are passed on are extremely dominant over others. A female orc who reproduces with a male ogre, for example, produces an ogrillan, a half-ogre, half-orc. Thing is, the orc genes are so strong that they literally just look like orcs. In fact, the lore states that only 10% of ogrillans can actually be told apart from normal orcs. That's how similar they look. Then, and a lot of people didn't know this, but when a male orc reproduces with a female ogre, that's when you get an Orog. Here's a picture of an Orog. Did you ever get any inclination that this guy right here is part ogre? Probably not. It just looks like an orc. And of course, the monster manual didn't even tell you that. You also have the Bugin, which comes from the union between orcs and quaggots, which literally just look like an orcish bugbear. These guys actually do look a bit different. But anyways, let's talk about the Orogs, which are the 3rd main kind of orc that exist in Faerun. Orogs are naturally born from the union of orcs and ogres. However, their birth can sometimes be random because many orcs are actually part ogre without, of course, realizing, because they all look the same. Ogrillans are sterile, so they cannot reproduce, but Orogs do intermingle with orcs and create ogrish strains that can reproduce among orcs. Sometimes they reproduce without necessarily knowing that they have this ogrish strain, and then Orogs can be naturally just randomly born. This is important because Orogs are actually considered to be very dangerous by orc warchiefs, because they're not just naturally stronger than normal orcs, but also substantially intelligent. They are also very charismatic, which means it is not unlikely for an Orog to eventually just gain command of the tribe. That is why it is not unlikely to see warchiefs just literally kill them when they are babies. However, many orcs consider Orogs to be a blessing from Luthik, orc goddess of fertility, and so clerics of Luthik will sequester those Orog babies and then raise them in secret. In any case, over 5,000 years ago as to the present day, there was a massive horde of orcs that attacked the north. This was the very first horde that had ever created by orcs in this continent. People knew at the time, back then, that they existed up in the mountains, but nobody really gave them much of an interest. For most of history, they were just primitive, stupid races that always fought each other. See, the legends claim that they were not one of the original races of the world, but instead they were summoned by one of the creator races eons ago through portals, probably as slaves or foot soldiers for wars. And then for thousands and thousands of years, they just lived up there in the mountains. But they had finally stopped squabbling. They got chieftains together who joined up and then formed the very first mega horde. Again, 5,000 years ago. Now, this horde, as impressive as it was, didn't succeed, for their enemy was the human empire of Netheril, and as you guys know, they were the greatest human empire that had ever existed in the past. I talk about them all the time. If you guys remember, it was the Netherese who were the first and only to ever have casted a level 12 spell, who of course ended up killing a god. You should watch this video if you're interested in that story. Now, the horde failed and retreated. However, one tribe could not retreat back into the mountains. They were the Skullbiters clan, an entire army made out of Orcs who were stuck between the human armies of the Netherese Empire in the north and the elven armies of the south. In their retreat, they found a cave system, a massive labyrinthine complex of caves that went deeper and deeper the more they went in. The Skullbiters clan had found an entrance into the Underdark, and they used it to escape their enemies, knowing that neither the elves nor the human wizards would follow them into the darkness. Down there, the Orcs of the Skullbiter clan developed their cities and civilization in the Underdark, becoming prolific smiths who worked the stone and the ore. Now, after thousands of years of evolution in the Underdark, they now look a bit different from their orcish cousins. Their ears are larger and their eyes are huge and pale. They are the smartest and physically strongest type of orc who are incredible at smithing and hence possess the best crafted armor and weapons. This is actually why the Orcs in the Monster Manual are not just stronger and smarter, but also possess plate armor. You probably didn't know why that was the case, huh? Now, any alliance between mountain orcs and Orcs is considered to be extremely dangerous to the inhabitants of the north, because that would mean that the normally dumb and badly geared orcs would have a constant source of weapons and armor, and of course, of strategy. Now, as the last type of orc in the Forgotten Realms, we have, well, the half-orcs. By most people's standards, a half-orc is simply an orc. There really isn't an actual difference. We as players, of course, know that there is a difference because we play the game, but to people in the Forgotten Realms, there really isn't. You might find these distinctions to be noted more in places like Waterdeep or Neverwinter, where there is a decent population of half-orcs that live there, but in any other place of the Savage North, you are simply an orc. If you go into the High Forest as a half-orc, you will be killed because you're an orc. If you go into the dwarven cities of the Silver Marshes, you will be killed because you are an orc. See, most people haven't actually seen an orc, like in real life. Brian, who lives in Tribor, who runs the general shop, has never seen an orc. Neither has any of his friends or family, and this applies to like 95% of the people in this world. The distinctions between an orc and a half-orc, they are lost to most people. And you combine this with the fact that many half-orcs actually do look just like orcs, and then you combine that with the fact that in any orc encampment, there's actually always a large portion of the orcs that are actually half-orcs. And then you combine that with the fact that most half-orcs that actually do exist are actually evil. So you combine all those things and you end up with this problem. Again, I want to reiterate, statistically speaking, the vast majority of half-orcs that exist in this world live in orc tribes and live as full orcs. They raid, they pillage like the rest of them. In fact, many of them are their leaders. This is a fact that many people don't know. Half-orcs are as strong as orcs. There really isn't a difference in raw physical strength. However, half-orcs are more charismatic and intelligent, and because half-orcs feel the need to overperform, to feel like they are part of the full-blood orc clan, means that they generally overexcel against their peers, which means they almost always end up in leadership positions in those orcish tribes. Orcs give 0 Fs about racial purity. They just don't care. Half-orcs lead orcs all the time. That being said, there is one good half-orc city. You can find it here in Vasa, and it is called the city of Palishuk. There are over 10,000 half-orcs that live there, and they trade happily with other races. But anyways, the most common type of half-orc are obviously orc-human, but you also see a lot of orc-goblin and orc-hobgoblin. These combinations amount to the vast majority of the half-orcs that you will ever see. Half-orc, half-dwarf is definitely possible, though half-orc, half-elf is not. An orc cannot reproduce with an elf, likely because Grumsh, chief god of the orcs, prevents it from happening. Elves are only meant to be killed, and an orc will go out of its way to make sure that every elf that crosses its path is murdered. Again, to reiterate, an orc will never even hold an elf as a slave, not even for torture. Elves are meant to just be murdered. Orcs are a patriarchal society where the men are the leaders and women are treated as not just much higher than slaves, to be honest. Women in orc society are mostly there for delivering babies, and male orcs tend to have many women. There are marriage customs, but orcs rarely follow them. Now, orcs are demanded by their god to destroy, to pillage, to raid, but also to indiscriminately reproduce. The word rape is never used, however it is implied. In first edition it says, quote, "They take slaves for work, food, and entertainment," in parentheses, torture, etc., end quote. In second edition, they say that women are fit only to bear children, and they say that orcs are cruel to them. In third edition, it says that an orc considers women chattel or personal possession, and that male orcs prize themselves on the number of females they own and how many male children they sire. Now, all of this mostly applies to the mountain orcs of the Forgotten Realms. Like I described them before, the nomadic grey orcs that live in the east are a little more civilized than that. Volos' Guide to Monsters described them as, quote, "The lore of humans depict orcs as rapacious fiends, intent on coupling with other humanoids to spread their seed far and wide. In truth, orcs mate with non-orcs only when they think such a match will strengthen the tribe. When orcs encounter humans who match them in prowess and ferocity, they sometimes strike an alliance that is sealed by mingling the bloodlines of the two groups," end quote. And this is the same lore that you will find in the player's handbook under half-orc, where it says, quote, "Whether united under the leadership of a mighty warlock or having fought to a standstill after years of conflict, orcs and human tribes sometimes form alliances, joining forces into a larger horde to the terror of civilized lands nearby. When these alliances are sealed by marriages, half-orcs are born," end quote. These quotes mostly apply to the civilized grey orcs and possibly the intelligent Aurochs of the Underdark. Mountain orcs are different because they are as bestial as one can imagine, and this doesn't necessarily apply to them. That being said, it does seem like they are obviously trying to back off from the rapey stuff in 5th edition, which makes sense to just remove that from the game. You shouldn't roleplay or directly use any of that in your game anyways, but there you have it. Now, orcs have a gestation period of 10 months and typically produce 2 to 3 children per birth. The thing is, infant mortality for orcs is actually quite high. Orcs tend to kill runts or any child that doesn't quite look as strong, certainly any born with any birth defects. Further, orc children are expected to train in combat literally as soon as they can hold a weapon, and since then, they are in danger all the time for the rest of their life. This can be as early as 4 years of age. In fact, a 12-year-old orc is considered, for all intents and purposes, a fully functioning adult, expected to mate and go to war. Typically, orcs don't make it past 25 because of the life they live. However, provided the orc doesn't die in combat or by disease, they will typically die of old age at around age 45. Orcs don't really get senile or become weak because of age, or at least not until they are basically just literally about to die of old age. They stay healthy almost up until the end. Orcs are carnivores, they only eat meat. Though shocking to some people, orcs actually prefer normal game meat rather than humanoid meat, something that tends to actually be rare amongst monsters. Monsters typically like humans rather than normal meat. Now, based on all of this that we have talked about, you will realize that the actual orcs that you will find when you play your 5th edition adventures is actually, again, the mountain orcs. There is currently no 5th edition adventure that is set all the way where you would find the grey orcs, and the one adventure set in the Underdark does not really have you encounter any Orc settlements as far as I remember. There are some Orcs in there, but nothing too significant. On the other hand, Lost Mines of Phandelver speaks of orcs, and you can encounter some in there too. Princess of the Apocalypse has an orc attack happening in one of the side quests, and then SKT has some in there as well. Since mountain orcs are scattered all across the mountains of the north, you actually have a good chance of finding them by just playing in this general area. Plus, the greatest horde of orcs is actually here, in the spine of the world, currently reigned in by King Obold, the greatest chieftain that they have ever gotten. A chieftain that, oddly enough, does not wish for war. They are called the Kingdom of Many Arrows, which encompasses a variety of different tribes banded together. So because the mountain orcs are the only type of orc that you might actually encounter in your adventures, I will actually take time to go a bit deeper into them versus the others. Let's talk about the mountain orcs. A mountain orc is quite obviously a monstrous creature to most of the civilized folk of Faerun. Mountain orcs look vaguely like primitive humans but are a fair bit taller at 7 or more feet in height. A rare few exceed 8 feet in height. They have stocky, powerful necks, and their bestial heads seem to sit directly on their massive shoulders. Their eyes are always a deep shade of red, and their faces are dominated by porcine snouts and large tusks. Mountain orcs often weave braids and tiny bones into their thick matted hair, which is usually black. Their clothing is crude and primitive, often composed of unpleasant colors like blood red, mustard yellow, yellow-green, and deep purple. They are far from the cleanest race in Faerun and delight in decorating their bodies with scars and war paint." End quote. These orcs are extremely warlike and destructive. They truly believe that one day they will take over and control the whole world. If you were to ask them directly, "Hey orc, what about your previous defeats in all of your previously failed hordes?" they would actually tell you that those defeats were merely tests of strength, that they were merely efforts to test the resources and resolve of their enemies. Now, they are strong, of course, but their greatest problem is their ability to band together, unlike the Grey Orcs, who were all part of a single empire, and unlike the Aurochs, who are smart and tactical. The Mountain Orcs are as savage as one can be, and are far more likely to fall into civil war and kill each other than to band together for a singular purpose. Quote, "The mountain orcs gather in immense tribes. Unlike the Grey Orc kin, mountain orcs are not nomadic. They select a cavern or old ruin as a lair and settle in. As their populations grow, crude new buildings and keeps are built, and in many places in the north, orc lairs have begun to resemble actual cities. When an orc city grows too large, the usual result is a bitter civil war that ends with the losing faction breaking off and fleeing to form its own tribe elsewhere. This tradition of infighting keeps most orc cities and fortresses from becoming too large. The size of a mountain orc tribe varies greatly depending on the success of the tribe and its age. Smaller tribes are rarely less than 50 members, and the larger tribes, such as the Torn Skull Orcs, can number in excess of 5,000 fighting orcs. The number of orc tribes in the north is past guessing, and tribes rise or vanish on a monthly basis. Nevertheless, several tribes are large and old enough to have become infamous throughout the region. The three major tribes of the Roving Mountains are a perfect example. The Red Fangs, the Heart Takers, and the Torn Skulls have long terrorized this region. The orc tribes in the foothills and heights of the spine of the world are by far the most numerous in total number, and it is also here that one of the most notorious and successful orc tribes now dwells, the Many Arrows tribe led by King Obold." End quote. When it comes to language, the mountain orcs actually tend to be fairly learned, since it behooves them to know different languages so that they can then interact with a very diverse roster of slaves that they can come in contact with. The Grey Orcs on the east are forced to learn different variations of Orc, since every single nomadic tribe has their own dialect of Orc, but Mountain Orcs here, on the other hand, have a single Orc language that is understood by all, and this allows them to learn Goblin and Giant whenever possible, and of course Common in order to talk to slaves. That being said, all Mountain Orcs are illiterate. They cannot read or write. Further, mountain orcs, like any other orc, is supposed to have a form of sunlight sensitivity, something that for some reason was removed from 5th edition. Orcs, like in normal mythology, work better at night than in the day. Now, this penalty is not supposed to be massive, like the penalty that Dark Elves would suffer, for example. Instead, for the entirety of Dungeons & Dragons, as in like all the way since 1st edition, orcs have always supposed to be taking a -1 to their attack rolls while out during the sunlight. It's not a big deal, I mean it's just a -1, but it's always been there. Plus, orcs are supposed to be easily blinded if you ever casted a spell like Daylight right in front of them. The monster manual didn't tell you any of these things, of course, they just removed it from the game for some reason. Anyways, orcs do their raids and pillages at night without torches because they have great dark vision. Mountain orcs don't really care much for magic, they value physical strength much more. However, when you do have an orc spellcaster like a cleric of Grumsh, you will see them focus hard on combat related spells, since it is their way of showcasing the might of their god. However, even in spite of this, mountain orcs consider magic to be the coward's route, something that would mostly be used by elves, which they of course detest. To embrace the use of magic is to concede that one's enemies are to be respected, a concept that doesn't sit well with, of course, many orcs. Elves use magic, so orcs shouldn't. Once again, this goes somewhat in direct opposition to what Volos Guide to Monsters says. Remember that Volos Guide to Monsters is more focused towards the Grey Orcs, not Mountain Orcs. Grey Orcs are religious fanatics, and Volos Guide to Monsters goes mega in depth about orc religion and of course orc gods, but this matters much less to mountain orcs. Quote, "The mountain orcs acknowledge the various orc deities, but they do not let matters of faith and religion get in the way of their goals. They assume that the orc deities place them in this world to do what they do best, and do not feel the need of constant support from clerics and the like. Almost all mountain orc clerics are worshippers of Grumsh, since the other members of the orc pantheon are thought of as little more than servants of Grumsh." End quote. Again, this goes into direct opposition to what Volos Guide to Monsters says, but again, just to reiterate a second time, they are talking about Grey Orcs in Volos Guide to Monsters. Those are magical, they are religious fanatics, they cast a lot of spells, they believe in their gods, and they have this crazy culture that revolves around gods. Mountain orcs do not. To follow this, whenever mountain orcs get magical items, they are typically either magical weapons or magical armor, something that has a direct and quick impact in combat. Preferably something that anyone can use and access, including things like rings and potions, or maybe a rod whose activation is just very simple, like just swinging it. Something more complicated like a staff filled with spells, or scrolls that would need enchantments to activate. Those are the sort of items that an orc might not understand and would then of course disregard as useless. And most of these magical items are typically found in the places they pillage. However, when they do make magic items, when they actually craft them, they typically make weapons of slaying. Weapons that are stronger when fighting elves or dwarves. Mountain orcs hate virtually any other race, except for those that they have an easy time controlling and communing with. Those being, of course, goblinoids, ogres, trolls, and sometimes hill giants. Everything else they basically just hate and destroy. Quote, "Mountain orcs have the technology and skill to build their own weapons and armor, and have specialized in the construction of specialty axes, such as the orc double axe. For equipment, armor, and non-axe weaponry though, the mountain orcs prefer to outfit their armies with gear and weapons looted from their defeated enemies. A mountain orc treats his axe with respect, but most of the rest of his equipment is neglected and ignored. When it finally breaks or falls apart, it is simply discarded and replaced at the earliest opportunity from loot taken from another enemy. They prefer to wear the best armor they can find or afford, usually scale mail. Mountain orcs use animals, beasts, and other monsters as guardians for their lairs, but usually such guardians are just as dangerous to the orcs as to potential intruders. They reason that taming a wild animal dulls the creature's instincts and senses, so a completely feral creature is much more effective a guardian. Generally, an orc tribe sets aside a section of their territory as a lair for these creatures. Chimeras, displacer beasts, manticores, face spiders, and winter wolves are often found living with orc communities in this manner. If the guardian creatures are unintelligent, the orcs instead incorporate them into traps, stoking underground pits and caves with the monsters and then rigging chutes and trapdoors into the floor to drop intruders into these caverns. Oozes and monstrous vermin are often used as living traps in this fashion." End quote. Once again, yet another massive difference between the mountain orcs and the grey orcs. Mountain orcs, as you can see, love to use monsters in their lairs as either traps or companions for help, whereas whereas Grey Orcs actually do not. They don't have a lot of pets. But there you have it. I do have access to some extra information on Orcs, and of course a lot, and I mean a lot of info on the Grey Orcs of the East, but this video is already crazy long as it is, and those Orcs are not the ones that you would be fighting if you were to play any 5th edition adventure. It is unfortunate because Grey Orcs have an extremely complex religious culture, and their gods are actually pretty cool, but most of their info, however, comes from Volos Guide to Monsters, which is a 5th edition book. What I try to do with this series, as much as I can, is to tell you all about the lore that you cannot find in 5th edition. So there's that. The last thing that I would want to mention though are the Teneroks, which are awesome. A Tenerok is essentially an orc tiefling. If a demon and an orc were to conceive a child, you would get a Tenerok. Now generally though, these are created when an orc chieftain makes a deal with Baphomet for power, though you can also create more Teneroks by having one breed with a female orc. The subsequent generations of orcs would then have a chance of spawning a Tenerok just in the same way as how it works with a normal tiefling, where you can just randomly get a tiefling in any random generation. These guys are very rare in Grey Orcs and Orc societies, since making a deal with a demon would be a very direct affront to Grumsh. But Mountain Orcs don't really care much about religion, and hence Teneroks are a lot more common in their societies, let's say that. These guys are crazy strong, but largely problematic. If there's ever one in a tribe, it'll try to take over the tribe by force, and then of course lead it to an endless war. Now I bet you can't wait to run Orcs in your adventures. If you do, make sure to check out the Epic Encounters, our sponsors for today. These miniatures are literally sick. The detail and quality are great, and the encounters on the booklet are for Frost Orcs, so they would work perfectly with the Mountain Orcs of D&D. The encounters and the miniatures are designed with heavy fur and cold weather gear, as you can see, and the battle map showcases frosty environs, so they work great if you wanted to use them for Mountain Orcs. They are not pig-faced, but that's alright, they are epic nonetheless.
In the frozen mountains of the north, you have come to end the terror of the Grimfang King and his army of raiders. The biting wind has slowed your pace as you approach the mountain hold. The air is painful to breathe, the snow thick and unyielding. You draw close. Distant torches lighting the icy ground. A rank odor fills your nostrils. The shouts of orcs fill your ears. Great beasts roar and slam against their bonds. You ready your weapons and prepare your attack. Battle is about to commence. Epic Encounters. Turn your RPG up to 11.
And there it is, man. Whenever I record one of these, 40 plus videos, 40-minute plus videos, I always end up with my voice just being shot. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. Just a few things that I want to say. I'm actually planning on streaming real soon. I haven't figured out exactly when I'm going to do it. By the time you see this, I might have actually streamed once, but I'm kind of getting ready to maybe start like some kind of schedule for streaming and kind of just get it going on a weekly basis if I can. So if you guys are interested in that, I'll be playing probably some Baldur's Gate, probably some Baldur's Gate 1, 2, and 3. And of course just any other game. I did a poll on my channel to see just what you guys were interested in seeing. It seems like a lot of you are definitely interested in just me playing RPGs of any kind. I would imagine that the closer to D&D, the better. So if you guys are interested in that, then go ahead and follow me on twitch.com/rhexxart. The link, of course, in the description. Make sure you do that if you want to catch me over there. But other than that, yeah, just thank you guys for watching. You guys are awesome. I would like to personally thank my Patreon supporters: Zach Bowell, Barry Maskant, 5E Magic Shop, Morgan Johnson, Rusty Rain, Biotechnofrag, Daniel Luna, Dog Feeder, Brad Salazar, Terry Culp, The Great Codini, Walker Motley, Omega Scales, Karathas the Bulwark, Siren King, Ozol, Ariel Nelson, Alex Cookson, Griffin Pierce, Falky951, Benjamin Bosters, Mr. Salty, Thomas Hunt, Tesla Coil, The Role-Playing Junkies Podcast, Prince Daylight Morning Crown, Sabim Kurshab, Slorensis, Ordoric, Nathan McCum, Silent Shoppa, Bushido Burrito, AG Dare, Soulless Rider, Roleplay with Advantage, Stalia, Lost Crusader, Tython, Treb909, Olaf Klepp, Tony Arzi, Garrett Minnick, JD Green, Kaser Sky, Famine52, George Votlin, Trevor Hess, Sovereign Mine, and Larian's Folly for supporting me on Patreon at the $25 level. If you would like to support me as well, then please head on over to patreon.com/MrRex to support. Alright guys, that's it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure and a privilege, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye-bye.